Emily Carter never imagined that planning her dead son's 8th birthday celebration would lead to discovering the most devastating betrayal of her life. What started as a mother's desperate attempt to honor Tyler's memory became an FBI investigation that exposed a network of theft so calculated and heartless that even seasoned federal agents were shocked by its cruelty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of how grief became a weapon against her, how family became predators, and how a 7-year-old boy's toy collection became the center of a federal crime that would destroy relationships forever. But it's also a story about justice, about fighting back when you have nothing left to lose, and about finding strength in the darkest moments of loss. The morning of Tyler's birthday dawned gray and cold, matching the emptiness that had settled in Emily Carter's chest 6 months earlier. She stood in the doorway of her son's room, unchanged since the day he lost his battle with leukemia, trying to summon the courage to begin what she'd promised herself she would do. Today, she would finally start going through Tyler's things. The room looked exactly as it had when Tyler was alive, his collection of vintage action figures still arranged on the shelves, in the precise order he'd insisted upon. His rare Pokémon cards sat in protective sleeves, organized by type and value. The limited edition Lego sets he'd saved his allowance for months to buy remained displayed on his desk, each piece perfectly in place. Tyler had been meticulous about his collections, a trait that had made other kids tease him but had filled Emily with pride. Her son knew the value of things, knew how to care for what mattered to him. The plan was simple and painful. Emily would pack one box of Tyler's most precious items to keep forever, donate some toys to the children's hospital where he'd spent his final months, and store the most valuable pieces in the garage until she was emotionally ready to decide their fate. Mark had offered to help, but Emily needed to do this alone. It felt like the last conversation she'd ever have with her son. She'd been sitting on Tyler's bed, holding his favorite Captain America figure, when her phone rang. The caller ID showed her sister Linda's name, and Emily almost didn't answer. Linda had been calling every few days since Tyler's death, always with suggestions about moving forward, getting back to normal, clearing out Tyler's room so Emily could heal properly. The calls meant well, but they felt like pressure Emily wasn't ready to handle. Something made her pick up anyway. Maybe it was the significance of the day, or maybe she just needed to hear another human voice in the suffocating silence of Tyler's room. Linda's voice was strangely cheerful, almost excited. "Emily, I know today's hard, but I wanted you to know that we took care of something for you. You don't need to worry about Tyler's collections anymore." The words didn't make sense. Emily looked around the room, at the shelves still full of Tyler's treasures, at the boxes she hadn't even started packing yet. "What do you mean, Linda? I'm literally sitting in his room right now. I haven't done anything with his collections yet." There was a pause, and when Linda spoke again, her tone had shifted to something that sounded almost offensive. "Emily, we couldn't let you torture yourself going through all that stuff. Mark gave us permission last week. We've been coming by when you were at therapy, getting everything organized and taken care of. We found collectors who really appreciate Tyler's things, people who actually use them instead of letting them sit around making you sad." Emily's blood turned to ice. She stood up so quickly that Tyler's Captain America figure fell from her hands, hitting the hardwood floor with a plastic crack that seemed to echo through the sudden silence in her head. Her eyes swept the room again, this time with growing horror. The shelves that should have held Tyler's complete collection of vintage Transformers were nearly empty. The display case where his most valuable Pokémon cards had been kept was gone entirely. The corner where he'd built an elaborate city from his Lego architecture sets was bare, except for dust outlines showing where the boxes used to sit. "Linda," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "What did you do? Where are Tyler's things?" Linda's response came quickly, as if she'd been preparing for this moment. "Emily, you need to understand. We got good money for everything. Really good money. That Pokémon collection alone was worth thousands. And those old toys from the 80s that Tyler loved so much, Collectors pay premium prices for mint condition pieces like his. We're talking about enough money to help you and Mark get back on your feet financially after all those medical bills. Emily sank back onto Tyler's bed, her free hand clutching the comforter that still smelled faintly of her son's shampoo. The medical bills Linda mentioned were real and crushing, but Tyler's collections weren't just valuable items to be sold. They were pieces of her son's soul, physical representations of his interests, his personality, his dreams for the future he'd never have. Each action figure had a story Tyler had told her. Each Lego set represented weeks of anticipation as he saved his allowance. Each Pokémon card held memories of trading sessions with friends, of Tyler's excitement when he finally found that rare holographic Charizard he'd searched for at every card shop in 3 counties. "You had no right," Emily managed to say, though her voice sounded strange and distant to her own ears. "Those weren't yours to sell. They were Tyler's. They were all I had left of him." Linda's voice took on an edge of impatience that Emily had never heard before. "Emily, they were toys. Tyler's gone, honey. He doesn't need them anymore, and keeping them around is just making it harder for you to move on. We did this because we love you. Because someone had to make the hard decisions while you're too emotional to think clearly." The line went dead, leaving Emily sitting alone in her son's half-empty room, holding a cracked Captain America figure and trying to process what felt like a second death. The toys weren't just toys. They were Tyler's legacy, his passions made physical, the things that had brought him joy during treatments and hospital stays, and the long months when he'd been too weak to play outside with other kids. And now they were gone, sold to strangers who would never know that the vintage Optimus Prime had been Tyler's comfort during chemotherapy, or that the complete set of original Star Wars figures had been his reward for making it through his first surgery. Her sister had taken the last pieces of her son and turned them into cash, claiming it was an act of love. Emily looked at the Captain America figure in her hands, its paint now chipped from the fall, and realized that this plastic crack might be the least of the damage that had been done. Something told her that Linda's story about helping with medical bills and collectors who would appreciate Tyler's things was only the beginning of a much darker truth. Emily's hands shook as she ended the call with Linda, but instead of collapsing into grief, something harder crystallized in her chest. She needed to see exactly what was missing, needed to document the scope of what had been taken from Tyler's room without her knowledge or consent. Moving with mechanical precision, she began photographing the empty shelves, the dust outlines on Tyler's desk, the gaps where his most prized possessions should have been. The vintage Transformers collection that Tyler had inherited from Mark's childhood was completely gone. The original boxes, the instruction manuals, even the small plastic weapons that came with each figure had vanished. Emily remembered Tyler spending hours transforming each robot, memorizing which pieces went where, teaching her the differences between Autobots and Decepticons with the patience of a natural teacher. The collection had been appraised at over $4,000 when they'd added it to their homeowner's insurance policy, but its sentimental value was immeasurable. His Pokémon card collection represented 3 years of Tyler's life. Every weekend, he'd begged Emily to take him to Premier Cards and Comics on Hamilton Street, where he'd carefully trade duplicate cards with other collectors, always working toward completing specific sets. The holographic Charizard he'd finally found had cost him 6 months of allowance, but Tyler had treated it like the Holy Grail. Emily could still picture his face the day he'd slid it into its protective sleeve, announcing that now his collection was, quote, museum quality. The entire collection, worth an estimated $8,000 according to the online price guides Tyler had studied religiously, was simply gone. But it was the missing Lego sets that broke Emily's heart most completely. Tyler had been obsessed with the architecture series, saving every penny of birthday money and allowance to buy the Statue of Liberty, the Empire State Building, the Sydney Opera House. He'd displayed them on special floating shelves Mark had installed, telling anyone who would listen that he was going to be an architect when he grew up, that he was going to design buildings that would last forever. The irony was unbearable. Tyler's buildings were supposed to last forever, but they hadn't even survived 6 months past his death. Emily walked to Tyler's closet and pulled out the wooden box where he'd kept his most special items. Inside should have been his signed baseball from the Riverside Raiders championship game, the limited edition Batman figure he'd won at the county fair, and the antique toy soldier that had belonged to Emily's grandfather. The box was empty except for a folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, Emily unfolded what appeared to be a handwritten receipt. Linda's familiar cursive listed item after item: vintage Transformers lot, Pokemon card collection, Lego architecture sets, signed baseball, collectible action figures. Next to each entry was a dollar amount, and at the bottom a total that made Emily's breath catch: $17,400. Not only had Linda sold Tyler's belongings, she'd kept meticulous records of every transaction. But what chilled Emily to the bone wasn't the money, it was the date on the receipt. March 15th. Tyler had died on February 28th. Linda had waited exactly 2 weeks after her nephew's funeral before beginning to liquidate his possessions, and she'd been systematic about it, taking items gradually so Emily wouldn't notice during her fog of grief. Emily's phone buzzed with a text message, this time from her mother, Patricia. "Linda told me you're upset about Tyler's things. Honey, we were trying to help. You can't shrine that room forever. Tyler would want you to use that money to take care of yourself." The casual dismissal in her mother's message ignited something fierce in Emily's chest. These weren't random people making decisions about Tyler's belongings. This was her family, people who had claimed to love Tyler, people who had attended his funeral and hugged Emily while she sobbed over his casket. And they had spent the last 6 months systematically stripping away every physical reminder of her son's personality, interests, and dreams. Emily scrolled through her phone contacts until she found Kevin Martinez, Linda's husband. If Linda was orchestrating this, Kevin had to be involved. When he answered, Emily could hear the tension in his voice immediately. "Emily, I'm glad you called. Linda's really upset that you're not seeing this as the blessing it is. We worked hard to find good homes for Tyler's stuff." "Good homes?" Emily's voice was deadly quiet. "Kevin, where exactly did you sell my son's collections? I want names, addresses, receipts for everything." There was a long pause before Kevin responded, and when he did, Emily detected something that sounded almost like panic. "Look, Emily, we went through legitimate dealers. Everything was handled professionally. The Pokemon cards went to a collector in Cincinnati who specializes in tournament-grade cards. The Lego sets went to an architectural firm that displays vintage sets in their lobby. The Transformers went to a toy museum that preserves 80s memorabilia." Kevin's explanations sounded rehearsed, too detailed, like stories he'd prepared in advance. But there was something else in his voice, an undercurrent of nervousness that made Emily suspect there was more to discover. "I want documentation for every sale," Emily said firmly. "I want to contact these buyers myself, make sure Tyler's things went to people who will appreciate them the way you claimed." "Emily, that's not really possible. These were private transactions, and the buyers value their privacy. Besides, what's done is done. The money is sitting in an account waiting for you. Isn't that what matters?" Emily closed her eyes, standing in the middle of Tyler's ransacked room, and realized that Kevin's evasiveness was answer enough. Whatever had really happened to Tyler's collections, it wasn't the fairy tale about appreciative collectors and museums that Linda and Kevin were trying to sell her. "I want every receipt, every contact, every piece of documentation by tomorrow," Emily said. "If you sold my son's belongings legitimately, then proving it shouldn't be a problem." Kevin's response was immediate and sharp. "Emily, you're being unreasonable. We're family. We were helping you through a difficult time, and this is the thanks we get? Maybe you should talk to someone about working through your grief in a healthier way instead of attacking the people who love you." The line went dead, leaving Emily alone with the devastating realization that her family's betrayal was deeper and more calculated than she'd initially understood. They hadn't just sold Tyler's things impulsively. They'd planned it, executed it systematically, and now they were closing ranks to hide the truth about where Tyler's precious collections had really gone. Emily sank into Tyler's desk chair and opened her laptop. If her family thought she would simply accept their explanations and move on, they had gravely underestimated what a mother's love could drive her to discover. She was going to find out exactly what had happened to every single item Tyler had treasured, and she was going to hold accountable every person who had participated in taking them. Emily stared at her laptop screen, cursor blinking in the search bar, when she heard Mark's car pulling into the driveway. Her husband had been at his brother's house, helping with a kitchen renovation, completely unaware of the devastation Emily had discovered in Tyler's room. She closed the laptop and walked downstairs, dreading the conversation she was about to have, but knowing Mark needed to know immediately what his sister-in-law had done. Mark walked through the front door whistling softly, a sound that had become rare in their house since Tyler's death. When he saw Emily's face, the whistling stopped abruptly. "Em, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," Emily said, her voice barely steady. "Mark, I need you to go upstairs and look at Tyler's room. Really look at it. Tell me what you see." Confusion crossed Mark's features, but he followed Emily up the stairs without questioning her further. She watched from the doorway as Mark entered Tyler's room, his eyes sweeping across the nearly empty shelves, the bare desktop, the missing display cases. She saw the exact moment understanding hit him. His shoulders sagged, and he turned to face her with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Where is everything? Where are Tyler's collections?" Mark's voice was quiet, controlled, but Emily could hear the undercurrent of rising panic. "Your sister sold them." Emily handed Mark the receipt she'd found in Tyler's treasure box. "All of them. While I was in therapy, while you were at work, Linda and Kevin were systematically cleaning out our son's room and selling his belongings to strangers." Mark read the receipt twice, his face growing paler with each item listed. When he reached the total at the bottom, he sank onto Tyler's bed, the paper trembling in his hands. $17,000, he whispered. Linda sold Tyler's collections for $17,000. "She claims they were trying to help us with medical bills," Emily said, sitting beside Mark on their son's bed. "She says they found collectors who would appreciate Tyler's things instead of letting them collect dust." "But Mark, look at this date. They started selling his stuff 2 weeks after the funeral." Mark stood up abruptly and pulled out his phone. Emily watched as he dialed Linda's number, his jaw set in a way she hadn't seen since the day they'd received Tyler's terminal diagnosis. When Linda answered, Mark didn't give her a chance to speak. "Linda, I'm standing in Tyler's room right now, looking at empty shelves where my son's collections used to be. Emily says you sold everything. Please tell me there's been some kind of misunderstanding." Emily could hear Linda's voice through the phone, high-pitched and defensive, but couldn't make out the words. Mark's expression grew darker as he listened. "Stop," Mark said, cutting Linda off mid-sentence. "Just stop talking and listen to me. You did not have permission to sell Tyler's belongings. I never gave you permission to enter our house while we weren't here. I never asked you to clean out Tyler's room. Where did you get the idea that any of this was okay?" Linda's response was loud enough for Emily to catch fragments. Something about helping family, about Emily being too emotional to make rational decisions, about Tyler not needing toys anymore. Each word seemed to make Mark angrier. "Linda, those weren't toys," Mark said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Those were Tyler's prized possessions. That Pokemon collection took him 3 years to build. Those Transformers were mine when I was a kid, and Tyler treasured them. The Lego sets represented his dreams of becoming an architect. You didn't sell toys, Linda. You sold pieces of my son's soul." Emily heard Linda's voice change, becoming more aggressive, more defensive. She was saying something about ungrateful family members and good intentions gone unappreciated. "Where's the money, Linda?" Mark asked suddenly. "If you sold $17,000 worth of Tyler's belongings to help us with medical bills, where's the money?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Emily wondered if Linda had hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its defensive edge and taken on something that sounded almost guilty. "The money is safe," Linda said. "We're holding it until you both can think more clearly about how to use it responsibly. Kevin thinks you should pay down the mortgage first, maybe do some home improvements that will increase the property value." Mark's face went white, then red, then white again. "You're holding our money? Money from selling our son's belongings? Linda, that money doesn't belong to you. Those items didn't belong to you. Nothing in this situation gives you the right to make financial decisions for our family. Mark, you're not thinking straight. Linda's voice carried clearly through the phone now, and Emily could hear the condescension dripping from every word. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You and Emily have been a mess since Tyler died. Someone needs to make practical decisions for this family, and Kevin and I are the only ones thinking clearly. When you're ready to be reasonable about Tyler's death and move forward with your lives, we'll talk about the money. Emily watched Mark's hand tighten around the phone until his knuckles went white. When he spoke again, his voice was colder than Emily had ever heard it. Linda, I want every item returned, or I want the contact information for every person who bought Tyler's collections. I want receipts, I want names, and I want them by tomorrow morning. If you can't provide that information, I'm calling the police. Linda's laughter was sharp and bitter. The police? Mark, we're family. We were helping you. You can't seriously be threatening to call the police on family members who are trying to do something good for you. Watch me, Mark said, and ended the call. Emily and Mark sat in Tyler's ransacked room, staring at each other in the gathering dusk. The magnitude of the betrayal was still sinking in, but Emily was beginning to understand that Linda and Kevin's theft was more complex than a simple case of family members making poor decisions. Mark, Emily said quietly, I don't think they ever intended to give us that money. I think they sold Tyler's things for themselves and are using our grief as cover for why we can't have the proceeds. Mark nodded slowly, his engineer's mind working through the logical implications of Linda's behavior. And I don't think they sold Tyler's collections to museums and collectors like Kevin claimed. If they had legitimate buyers who appreciated Tyler's things, why wouldn't they provide contact information? Why all the secrecy? Emily felt something cold settle in her stomach as the pieces began fitting together. Linda and Kevin hadn't just betrayed their trust. They had orchestrated an elaborate theft using Emily's grief and Mark's absence as opportunities to systematically loot Tyler's room. And now they were holding the proceeds hostage while claiming it was for Emily and Mark's own good. We're calling the police tomorrow, Emily said, and Mark nodded grimly. Neither of them realized that by tomorrow, the police would be the least of Linda and Kevin's problems. Emily woke the next morning with a determination she hadn't felt since before Tyler's diagnosis. She and Mark had stayed up late the previous night, making lists of Tyler's missing items and trying to piece together a timeline of when each theft might have occurred. The magnitude of Linda and Kevin's deception was becoming clearer with every detail they remembered. Mark had already left for work with a promise to call the Riverside Police Department during his lunch break, but Emily couldn't wait that long. She needed answers, and she needed them now. She decided to start with the one piece of concrete evidence they had, the receipt Linda had left behind. If Linda and Kevin were telling the truth about legitimate sales to collectors and museums, then tracking down these supposed buyers should be straightforward. Emily drove to Premier Cards and Comics first, the shop where Tyler had spent countless weekend hours building his Pokémon collection. The owner, a middle-aged man named Dave, had known Tyler personally and had often set aside rare cards when they came into the store. If anyone in Riverside would know about a major Pokémon collection being sold, it would be Dave. The bell above the door chimed as Emily entered, and Dave looked up from behind the counter with a smile that quickly faded when he saw her expression. Emily, I haven't seen you since. Dave's voice trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. How are you holding up? I need to ask you something, Dave, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Emily pulled out her phone and showed him a photo of Tyler's Pokémon collection. Have you seen these cards recently? Has anyone tried to sell you this collection or parts of it? Dave's face went pale as he examined the photo. Emily, Tyler's collection was incredible. These cards are worth serious money, especially that holographic Charizard. Why are you asking? Did something happen to them? My sister-in-law sold them, Emily said, watching Dave's reaction carefully. She claims she found a collector in Cincinnati who specializes in tournament-grade cards. Have you heard anything about a collection like this being sold in the area? Dave shook his head slowly, but Emily could see something troubling in his expression. Emily, I need to tell you something, but you're not going to like it. About 3 weeks ago, a guy came in here trying to sell individual cards from what looked like Tyler's collection. I recognized some of the cards because they had specific wear patterns I remembered from when Tyler would bring them in to show me. Emily's heart began pounding. What guy? Did you know him? Never seen him before. Older guy, maybe 50s, said he'd inherited the cards from a relative. But Emily, here's the thing that bothered me. He was trying to sell them individually, at way below market value, like he just wanted to get rid of them fast. When I asked him about the rest of the collection, he got nervous and said he only had a few cards to sell. Did you buy any of them? Emily asked, though she dreaded the answer. Dave nodded reluctantly. I bought 3 cards because I felt bad for the guy, and honestly, I thought maybe I could eventually get them back to you somehow. I had no idea your family was involved in selling Tyler's stuff. Emily, if someone sold Tyler's entire collection for quick cash, they probably got a fraction of what it was actually worth. Emily felt sick. Tyler's collection hadn't gone to an appreciative collector in Cincinnati. It had been broken up and sold piecemeal to various dealers for far less than its true value. Dave's revelation meant that Kevin had lied about every detail of the Pokemon card sale. From Premier Cards and Comics, Emily drove to Treasure Hunt Collectibles on Pine Avenue, a store she'd never visited but had heard advertised on local radio. If Linda and Kevin were lying about the Pokemon cards, they were probably lying about everything else too. Treasure Hunt Collectibles occupied a narrow storefront between a pawn shop and a check-cashing business, and Emily immediately understood why she'd never brought Tyler here. The store felt more like a warehouse than a specialty shop, with items crammed onto shelves without any apparent organization or care. The owner, a heavy-set man with greasy hair, looked up from a magazine when Emily entered. Help you find something? I'm looking for information about some items that might have been sold here recently, Emily said, pulling up photos of Tyler's Lego sets on her phone. Architecture series sets, vintage Transformers, collectible action figures. Have you seen anything like this? The man's expression immediately became guarded. Lady, I see a lot of stuff come through here. Can't remember every item. Emily studied his face and realized he was lying. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition when she'd mentioned the specific items. These belong to my son, who passed away. My family sold them without my permission, and I'm trying to track them down. Look, I'm sorry for your loss, but I run a legitimate business here. Everything I buy legal with proper paperwork. If you got family issues, that's between you and them. The man's defensive response confirmed Emily's suspicions. He had seen Tyler's collections, and he knew exactly what she was talking about. But his refusal to provide any information meant she needed help from someone with more authority than a grieving mother asking questions. Emily left Treasure Hunt Collectibles and sat in her car for several minutes, trying to process what she'd learned. Tyler's precious Pokemon cards had been broken up and sold for quick cash to multiple dealers. His Lego sets and Transformers had likely been sold to the sketchy collectibles store whose owner was now refusing to cooperate. Nothing Linda and Kevin had told her about finding appreciative collectors was true. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed her brother Danny's name, which surprised her. Danny rarely called, and when he did, it was usually to ask for money or favors. Emily, Linda told me what happened yesterday, Danny said without preamble. She's really upset that you and Mark are being so ungrateful. Mom thinks you should apologize. Emily felt a surge of anger so strong it made her hands shake. Apologize? Danny, they stole Tyler's belongings and sold them. They entered my house without permission and took my dead son's prized possessions. What exactly should I be apologizing for? Come on, Em. They were trying to help you move on. You can't keep Tyler's room like a shrine forever. It's not healthy. Emily realized that Danny's call wasn't random. Linda had sent him to pressure her into backing down, to make her feel like she was the unreasonable one for wanting Tyler's belongings returned or accounted for. Danny, did you know they were doing this? Did you know Linda and Kevin were going through Tyler's room and selling his collections? There was a pause that lasted too long. Emily, We all knew you and Mark were struggling. We all wanted to help somehow. That's not what I asked, Danny. Did you know they were stealing Tyler's things and selling them? It's not stealing if it's family, helping family, Danny said, but his voice lacked conviction. Emily hung up without another word. Her family wasn't just complicit in Linda and Kevin's theft. They were actively working together to pressure her into accepting it. The betrayal was deeper and more coordinated than she had imagined. She started her car and drove straight to the Riverside Police Department. Mark would understand why she couldn't wait for him to make the call. Some betrayals were too devastating to handle through family phone calls and diplomatic conversations. It was time to involve people who understood the difference between family helping family and theft. Detective James Mitchell looked up from his paperwork when Emily walked into the Riverside Police Department that afternoon, her hands clutching a folder filled with photos, receipts, and documentation of Tyler's missing collections. She had rehearsed what she would say during the drive over, but sitting across from Detective Mitchell in the small interview room, Emily found herself struggling to find words that could adequately convey the magnitude of her family's betrayal. Mrs. Carter, I understand you want to report a theft, Detective Mitchell said gently, his notebook open and pen ready. Can you tell me what happened? Emily pulled out the photographs she'd taken of Tyler's empty room and spread them across the table. My son Tyler died 6 months ago from leukemia. These photos show his room now, and these show what it looked like before. She placed the before photos next to the current ones, the contrast stark and heartbreaking. My sister-in-law Linda Martinez and her husband Kevin systematically entered my home while I was at therapy sessions, and my husband was at work. They stole my son's entire collection of toys, games, and memorabilia, then sold them for $17,000. Detective Mitchell examined the photos carefully, making notes as Emily explained the timeline of events. When she showed him the handwritten receipt Linda had left behind, his expression grew more serious. Mrs. Carter, this receipt appears to document premeditated theft of items with significant monetary value. The fact that they kept records suggests they knew what they were doing was wrong, but they planned it carefully anyway. He looked up from his notes. Have you attempted to recover any of these items or the money from the sales? Emily explained her conversations with Linda and Kevin, their refusal to provide buyer information, and their claim that they were holding the money until Emily and Mark could think more clearly. She told him about her visits to the comic shop and collectibles store, and how the evidence suggested Tyler's collections had been broken up and sold for far less than their actual value. Detective Mitchell, what they stole wasn't just valuable, these were my son's prized possessions. His Pokemon cards represented 3 years of his life. His Lego sets represented his dreams of becoming an architect. They didn't just steal money from us. They stole the last physical connections I had to my son's personality and interests. Detective Mitchell set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Carter, I'm going to be straight with you. This case has several factors that make it more serious than typical family theft. The monetary value exceeds our felony threshold, the items belong to a deceased minor, and the perpetrators appear to have used your grief as an opportunity to commit systematic theft over several months. I'm going to recommend this case to our financial crimes unit. 2 hours later, Emily was sitting in a different office with Detective Lisa Hammond from the Financial Crimes Unit and Agent Rebecca Torres from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. Agent Torres had been called in because Emily's case showed patterns consistent with other investigations they were conducting. Mrs. Carter, Agent Torres began. We've been tracking a network of individuals who target grieving families, particularly those who have lost children. They gain access to homes under the guise of helping with cleanup or estate management, then systematically steal valuable items for resale. Your case matches this pattern perfectly. Emily felt the world tilt slightly. You're saying Linda and Kevin are part of some kind of organized crime? Detective Hammond pulled out a file folder. We've had 3 similar cases in the past year. In each case, family members or close friends volunteered to help grieving parents deal with a deceased child's belongings, then sold valuable items and kept the proceeds. The perpetrators always claimed they were trying to help the family move on. Agent Torres opened her laptop and turned it toward Emily. We've been monitoring treasure hunt collectibles for months. The owner, Ron Blackwood, has been buying stolen goods from multiple sources and reselling them online to international buyers. When we saw your husband's sister and brother-in-law on our surveillance footage, we knew we had found another victim. Emily stared at the grainy security footage, showing Linda and Kevin unloading boxes at the collectibles store. The timestamp showed they had made multiple trips over several weeks, each time carrying items that Emily now realized must have been Tyler's belongings. "We've recovered most of your son's collections," Detective Hammond said softly. "They were being prepared for shipment overseas, but we seized them as evidence before they could be sold. The Pokémon cards, the Lego sets, the vintage toys, they're all in our evidence locker." Emily began crying then, tears of relief mixed with anger and grief. Tyler's treasures weren't gone forever. His Pokémon cards wouldn't end up scattered across the globe. His Lego architecture sets wouldn't be dismantled and sold as individual pieces. Agent Torres continued, "Linda and Kevin Martinez have been arrested and charged with grand theft, trafficking in stolen goods, and conspiracy. Ron Blackwood is facing federal charges for operating a criminal enterprise. Based on our investigation, they stole and sold over $200,000 worth of items from grieving families over the past 2 years." The scope of the crime network stunned Emily. Linda and Kevin hadn't just betrayed her family. They had been systematically targeting other families in their most vulnerable moments, stealing memories and mementos from parents who had lost children. "What about the money?" Emily asked. "The $17,000 they got for Tyler's things?" Detective Hammond smiled grimly. "We've frozen all their accounts and seized their assets. Every penny will be returned to the victims, including your family. Linda and Kevin won't be profiting from their crimes." 6 months later, Emily stood in Tyler's room, carefully arranging his returned collections on the shelves where they belonged. Every Pokémon card was back in its protective sleeve. Every Lego set had been reconstructed and displayed exactly as Tyler had arranged them. His vintage Transformers stood in perfect formation, each one a testament to his careful attention to detail. Linda received 8 years in federal prison. Kevin got 6 years. Ron Blackwood was sentenced to 15 years for running the criminal enterprise. The other families victimized by the network also recovered their stolen items and received restitution. Emily had learned to live with Tyler's death, but she would never have to live without his memory. His room remained exactly as he had left it, not as a shrine to grief, but as a celebration of a 7-year-old boy who had loved collecting things, building things, and organizing his treasures with meticulous care. The real victory wasn't the criminal convictions or the recovered money. The real victory was justice for Tyler and every other child whose memory had been violated by people who saw grief as an opportunity for profit. Some betrayals are unforgivable, but some justice is worth fighting for, no matter how much it hurts. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.